The broadband and technology skills gap that exists in the U.S. urban areas often decides whether individuals can become part of the connected digital economy and education. What does this mean for the U.S. and for Erie, Pennsylvania? That's what we'll cover here as we dive into this multifaceted issue. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Here in this conversation, you're going to hear from Mr. Matthew Wiertel, the Director of Sales and Marketing at Velocity Network. Matthew is offering this presentation as after having successfully completed the Jefferson Civic Leadership Academy in 2016, he's most recently participated in the JES's Raimy Fellowship Program, which is under the facilitation of JES Scholar in Residence, Dr. Andrew Roth. Now, you might know Dr. Roth from his American Tapestry Project radio program that airs on WQLN Public Media and is available online at WQLN.org and the NPR One app, a project he launched at the Jefferson and continues to explore in his residency. Now, after an accomplished career in academia from lecturing to leading, where he taught various courses before going on to serve in administrations in Erie and lead Notre Dame College in Cleveland as its president, before retiring and being named president emeritus, and then stepping out of retirement to lead St. Bonaventure University as its interim president, Dr. Roth has joined the JES team. In addition to his regular publications and presentations, he facilitates the Raimy Fellowship Project. Before I turn it over to Dr. Roth to explain more about the Raimy Fellowship Program and to introduce today's presenter, I do want to remind viewers and listeners that since this conversation is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we'll work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question or a comment, just leave it in the comment section below. Now, if you're listening or watching a later broadcast of this event, please still feel free to send us those questions, those comments to keep the conversation going, as we'll get those along to Mr. Matt Wiertel. And of course, for more information about both past and upcoming JES programs and publications, please visit jeserie.org and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Now, Dr. Roth, tell us a bit about the Raimy Fellowship Program, and then please introduce today's presenter, Mr. Matthew Wiertel, to us. Dr. Roth.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I'm really excited to hear Matt's presentation today. Matt is a member of our Raimy Fellows program at the Jefferson. And the Raimy Fellows program, let me briefly explain what it is, its genesis and what we try to do it. The Raimy Fellows program exists through the generosity of one of the Jefferson's benefactors, Bruce Raimy, after whom it is named. And it was in response to requests by members of the Civic Leadership Academy for a little more leadership theory, and also perhaps that they would be willing to take on an independent research project. So for the last, I think we're now in our third year, last 2 or 3 years, we've been doing the Raimy Fellows program, which consists of 2 parts. Part 1 is a kind of highly condensed, I'm not going to call it graduate seminar, but a very highly condensed look at some leadership theory and some key ideas in leadership theory. But the real heart of the program is the research program, in which the individual Raimy Fellows, either working collaboratively in groups of 1 or 2 or 3, or working alone, undertake a research project. In 2018-2019, we had 5 Raimy Fellows who completed 4 research projects. I'm using a virtual background, so I don't know. Well, see, there we go. And anyways, we have a Jefferson publication, 2019 Raimy Ideas. And in that year, we had a number of quality research projects. Seth Trott and Michael Outlock did a project on barriers to entry about creating a storefront minority business incubator, which idea is still floating in Erie, and there's some possibility that will actually come to fruition. Yamura Shakur Hooker did a research project on urban gardens as one possible solution to dealing with food deserts in Erie. She had a really interesting creative idea of food trucks that were not restaurants, but mobile farmers markets, after an idea I think that's used in Toronto. And April Soriano did a research project on sharing skills, building a volunteer network to serve people in rural Erie County. This year, COVID-19 impacted us. Matt was a member of the 2019-2020 group, and as several people were bringing their projects to conclusion in the spring, COVID-19 happened, and our energy somehow got dissipated as we dealt with different things. And so Matt is he'll pardon the expression here, Matt is in some ways our test crash dummy, because he's our first live stream Raimy Fellow presentation. His presentation may or may not ultimately, it's up to him, take the form of a written essay. I think we would like to see that because he's done all this work. But we're going to be working with some other Raimy Fellows from the previous class. I'm not going to put anybody on the hook by mentioning their name. And we have 4 or 5 people working on projects this year, one of which is actually going to take a feed off of Matt's project. And of course, Matt's project, and he's been working on this for the last, 15 months or so, but it also ties directly into his day job, as it were, his real job, is going to be exploring the digital divide, what's meant by that phrase, how it impacts Erie and communities like Erie and Erie County, and also outlining or at least discussing some potential solutions to it. As Ben alluded to, and as you can see on the slide from Matt's presentation in front of you, Matt's a graduate of the 2016 Civic Leadership Academy. He's the Director of Sales and Marketing for Velocity Network, has an MBA from Penn State Erie, the Barron College, and almost or nearly 20 years experience in technology and telecommunications. But most importantly, he's the father of Leo and Winnie and the husband of Shannon. So I'm looking forward to hearing Matt's presentation today, and I'm very grateful for him for being willing to take this adventure with us in our first live stream Raimy Fellow presentation.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Roth, and I can't think of anybody better to be our crash test dummy here as we explore digital learning as we're doing that at the Jefferson. So I'm grateful to have Mr. Matthew Wiertel here with us. A friendly reminder for folks looking to read any one of the prior Raimy ideas that were published from the inaugural cohort. Those are available at jeserie.org. You can find that on our website there. We'll be sure to put a link to that in our Facebook page as well. But Mr. Wiertel, if you wouldn't mind, set the agenda for us today for your presentation, please.
Well, as a crash test dummy, I forgot my helmet, so I left that in the car or it's somewhere in my office here. So I appreciate kind of being breaking through the technological ceiling here of kind of being the first Raimy Fellow to go live streaming. So thank you, Dr. Roth and Ben, for those kind words and kind of kicking things off. So really what we're going to talk about today is something that's interesting and is interested to me, as Dr. Roth and Ben have commented. In my day job, I work for Velocity Network. So we're a regional IT and telecommunications company, and we've been kind of in the internet and broadband business since 1996, really since dial-up and dinosaurs ruled the earth when the internet was kind of a new thing to now where the internet is really the latest form of a utility. So one of the things that really is we've kind of uncovered is there's this digital divide, and really what many people see as a rural digital divide. We're going to focus today on really the urban digital divide, which is really kind of overlooked in a lot of aspects of our society and our economy. So we'll kind of define that at a high level, and then we'll kind of go through some root causes of the research that I've kind of brought together over the last course of the last year or so. Time seems to be sliding by, of kind of what are the causes of that urban digital divide, and then some interesting pieces on how coronavirus or COVID-19 have kind of impacted this divide and potentially have shown some opportunities to be able to kind of solve some of the challenges that we're seeing that historically have faced the communities that have the divide. And then kind of wrap up with some recommendations and potential solutions really for the Erie community specifically, but kind of some examples potentially of what other communities across the United States are kind of taking a look at. So we'll kind of dive into this right now. And Ben, if there's any questions along the way, feel free to shout them out and try to answer them the best of my ability. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Matt. And I think this is the best place to start. For those who need a refresher or perhaps that introduction, define for us what the urban digital divide is and get us started on this. Thank you, Matt.
So really at kind of its core definition, the urban digital divide really breaks down to the broadband and technology skills gap that exists in the urban areas of the United States. So like I said a minute ago, when we usually have and talk about the digital divide, it's usually the rural divide. So folks that live outside of urban areas and their inability to get connected. But what we're going to talk about today is really focusing on the divide that exists inside the urban cores and the urban centers of not only Erie, but communities all across the country. So the divide is not only caused by a potential lack of broadband, which typically, like I said, is usually when you use the term digital divide, they're just talking about the inability to connect to broadband services, but other factors that contribute to a person's inability to become part of the connected digital economy. So, and I have a statistic here that 80% of the broadband adoption gap, which is the percentage of individuals that do not subscribe to internet service, is due to factors other than network deployment. So usually what you see from policymakers, and if you see any of the policy that usually comes out from the federal government, or even state and local governments, they're always talking about the digital divide, and that's really always focused on the rural components of society and the folks that are the farthest from broadband. So like I said, today we're going to focus kind of on a completely different kind of spinning that on its head. So there's,
So if I can ask a question, Matt. So if I understand you correctly, and the digital divide is most commonly, most people, lay people, not in the high tech business, think of it as lack of access to Wi-Fi.
Exactly. So
where in fact, most of it is lack of knowledge of how to use the technology, or lack of understanding the need to use the technology. And I think that's a really interesting observation, because I know when I've heard most people talk about digital divide, they talk about lack of connectivity, but the lack of knowing how to use the technology is also critical. Just a simple little aside here, any classroom teacher listening to this will have had this experience, that a lot of times, my experience is higher education, a lot of times people just assume students coming in know how to use software because they're always on their phone, they have iPads, this, that, or the other thing. But what you discover rather quickly is knowing how to use beyond bare bones things like simple word processing programs, much less PowerPoint, or even things that are small database management tools, or the most common one where you run into it that is really kind of startling is Excel. So I think that's an important observation right there that you just made.
Right. So I think that we'll go over a couple root causes of the digital divide, the urban digital divide. And you just touched on it, Dr. Roth. Digital literacy and kind of that individual divide is really one of the main causes. So you think of the skills gap. So basic and advanced skills are really required to succeed in today's digital economy, and are not available to those that need those skills the most. So when you kind of look at where the economy has moved, and we've really moved from a platform of manufacturing, really labor intensive jobs and skills required, not a lot of digital skills really required to complete those tasks, to now where, according to Brookings Institution, 2/3 of all jobs generated between 2016 and 2019 required a medium to high level of digital skills. And where are those folks that are filling those jobs getting that digital literacy training? And that's really one of the biggest challenges, is that training is not inherently available or readily available to those folks that need it the most. We'll go into some examples a little bit later, but kind of even an example in my own personal environment, we have Amazon Alexa inside our home, smart home. My son's 2.5, and he already picked up on how to say Alexa to tell her to do something, right? But he's grown up in that in our household over the last 2.5, 3 years. Whereas typically those that haven't had the access to kind of those digital experiences, are kind of left behind. So that's what really creates that individual divide. between folks that, have access to those skills or have kind of grown up in those skills and those that have not.
That's really interesting to me as I was about to say as an educator, but that sounds almost, I don't know, it just sounds a little, I'm not sure what it sounds like, but I didn't like the sound of it. But as me, as someone who's been involved in teaching and education for so long, one of the major differentiators in terms of children's academic experience used to be, one of the barometers was the number of books in the home. Were books and magazines actually physically present in the home? And then take it another step, that people actually read to the children, da-da-da-da-da. And what you've just pointed out is that in this day and age, there's another level to it, that children who grow up in an environment where, in a media-rich environment, to use a not particularly bright phrase, but they have a huge advantage, or flip that around the other way in terms of the divide. Children who grow up in the absence of that are left behind. That I hadn't thought of it that way before. That's an interesting insight.
Yeah, well, even look at, and this comes back to kind of the COVID changes, but, the examples I had in the paper kind of before the research before COVID were, if anybody's gone to Walmart, Sam's Club, pick your store that you shop at, right? You can now use your cell phone as kind of your scanning mechanism to check out. That's how we get through Sam's Club as fast as we can, right? With two small children and not having to deal with the line and even the self-checkout, which is more advanced for some. There's no training available on how to use those things. There's no training on how to use your iPhone or your smartphone. It just comes in a box and you plug it in, and Apple or Android or Google just says you need to figure out how to use it. So there's no training on how to use a lot of these tools, even from Amazon or Google Smart Home. You just kind of have to figure it out. But I think there's some innate nature of Gen X or Gen Y, Gen Z, whatever Gen millennials, that we just kind of always evolved with the technology and just kind of had to figure it out as we go. Yes, my siblings might be a little bit faster on some of the new trends than I am, but for those that haven't grown up in those particular environments, it's that much more of a challenge. So as things continue to shift, it's just that gap, that divide is just going to continue to widen over time.
And there's a generational aspect to it. Both
Right.
of you guys are too kind to say it, but I'll say it. In my generation, it's get a grandchild, get one of your grandkids to show you how to use the thing.
Right.
Well, and Andy, to that point, and Matt, I think this is one of the important things that you've touched on in your research, is that not only do these jobs require some proficiency, if not, as you noted with the Brookings there, a medium to high level of digital skills, it's often the skills needed to even apply for those jobs.
Right.
And so opening up an application and typing in a resume might be a skill that somebody had not had to have, especially if they're leaving one sector of a workforce and entering another. I can recall a story Deborah Fallows had told before, correspondent for The Atlantic and co-author of Our Towns, about witnessing at libraries, a story she was told, somebody using whiteout on the screen of the computer to work on a resume. And so this is a big challenge when it comes to the individual divide. Not everyone is equally equipped with the skills necessary to apply for not just tomorrow's jobs, but today's jobs.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Ben, especially in terms of where a lot of things have moved in terms of COVID. A lot of things that were in person or paper driven, or hey, you want to pay your taxes, or you want to fill out like you said, a job application, or you want to order something. Everybody has moved very, very quickly to a digital kind of contactless world, without necessarily investments or the training available for those that need it the most. So yes, certain of us that have smartphones and are proficient on smartphones and doing those things, yes, we can order our groceries online and go pick them up, or we can use Grubhub or those different sort of applications to order food, or go to websites for the particular facilities to do that. But others can't. So they're either relying on analog methods, telephone, and those sorts of investments from vendors may have not been made in the traditional analog methods that people need to connect. They're only, focusing their investments on the technology, and that not only goes for the private sector, but the public sector as well.
And so, Matt, I've got to ask, in your research, did you come across initiatives or efforts being made nationally, locally, maybe even internationally, if there are global leaders on this? What folks are doing to try to bridge that in terms of retraining the individuals who need it, or at least making sure that it's accessible to those who need those kinds of skills training? And I guess I go back to thinking of the library anecdote from Deb Fallows of libraries filling that role sometimes in some communities. What did you find in your research, in terms of what's being done, or what people are working on to narrow this gap?
So one of the challenges is there's really no kind of clear set of national standards to say, here's what digital literacy means or training, right? Because it's such a broad topic and it's always evolving. So, things like we're doing now with Zoom, that's a digital literacy training in of itself, or Microsoft Teams, or, different applications that we're using. But, there's examples of, there's a program in Washington, D.C. called Bite Back, which basically has kind of built a platform around not only digital literacy tools, but they have, in-person training, which now, probably has moved online, which presents its own challenges, to basically build people up with giving them the basic tools they need to leverage digital applications. Housing authorities have been another area of innovation. Nationally, the Housing Authority in the city of Austin basically has built a nationally recognized model for combating the urban digital divide. So they have partnered with Google Fiber in Austin, and they basically have kind of built out a model of providing access, so providing the level of access needed, so the basic internet access required. But then they've also gone around and kind of developed champions inside the housing units to say, okay, Ben, if you're, somewhat more technically able, let's kind of certify you as the expert in your housing community, and then let you be the teacher and train those and help facilitate the education that could go from one person to another. So kind of lift the folks up in the community, build their skills, and kind of let them be the evangelist to kind of show those digital skills to their friends and family and their neighbors that are going to listen to them the most, and kind of to Dr. Ross' point, hey, I'm going to call my grandson or granddaughter to help me out. Well, hey, I'm going to call, Ben, who lives down the street or in the unit next door, to kind of help me out with my smart TV or my laptop, because he or she has been designated as kind of that expert in our housing unit. So they've provided a pathway for that, and then they also provide access to hardware, which is something that we'll get to here in a couple of slides.
Thanks, Matt. And so before we move on, just a real quick question. In your findings, before we take a look at the defined benefits of internet and what that brings, you had mentioned the lack of a federal response to this in terms of a blanket policy. Do you think it's better spent, resources better spent drafting a federal policy that moves the entire nation forward? Or do you think it's better spent that we continue working on the local level and seeing funds deployed there? Or is it a healthy mix of both? Essentially, what would you recommend if you had a magic wand to fix this? What's the path forward on that?
Well, I think it's it's definitely, there's somewhere in the middle, right? So the people on the ground locally know the needs probably the most. So I think that's where identifying those needs and then figuring out, what are the funding mechanisms to do that. I think there are already some pathways through funding through the federal government that can be tied to potentially, like I said, housing authorities or other block grant opportunities that are there. I think it's just working through the various federal programs and understanding, does it have to fall into a training kind of guise, or can it fall under an infrastructure component? Where do those pieces live? But I really think it's one, understanding what are the needs and the critical needs, and I think COVID has kind of exposed that, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But then also understanding where the funding is coming from And I think in the research that I've done, it's really a partnership usually between a public institution and a private entity. So I mentioned, Google Fiber is potentially, yes, they're a multi-billion multinational corporation, but, they've partnered with the folks in Austin. There's other partnerships that have been, created in other places across the country, where it's a private institution. It might be a private internet service provider or a private technology provider saying, hey, I've got the expertise and the wherewithal to help. And then partnering with, it might be a local community college or a local institution, a Fortune 500 company, and trying to figure out, who plays what role, and then putting together a program that helps, solve that particular need. So, kind of that top-down approach from the federal government may not be the best approach, but I think having some pilot programs, and I think the HUD and other federal agencies have kind of developed those types of programs to say, hey, let's build a model and help fund it. And then if that model works, maybe multiply it or make it the same sort of thing across the country. I think it's just trying to get creative in terms of figuring out what's the best use and the best strategy to go after those funds.
It sounds like some guide rails in place from the federal might help steer this and direct it better, and then see that local deployment and local guidance, since those are the folks that seem to know the issues in and out more closely, like you do. But Matt, let's talk about the importance of the internet, because I think that when we think of the urban digital divide, we think also not just the ability to pull up a Word document and craft a resume, but the ability to share that resume and get it out there to people that might be hiring or might want to hire you. So talk to us about the role the internet's playing in all of this.
So I think that's the kind of the glue that ties all of this together. So at the end of the day, you need access. So how do people get access? And then I think one of the interesting things in terms of the research that I've done is there has to be a defined benefit of the access. So for example, if I'm an individual and obviously I have limited budget, or I have fixed income, I have to decide what makes the most sense for me individually to use those limited funds for. So am I going to purchase an internet service that I'm not going to use, or am I going to, purchase some other service or pay for some other need that I have to have? So interestingly enough, as people, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, as people have kind of grown up through, their years and said, hey, I've been fine without using the internet. I don't need a debit card. I don't do online banking. I'm able to do all of these things on a daily basis without the internet. They've just not invested in it. So there hasn't been a defined benefit for them to buy the internet service. But as we've just mentioned, as more of these processes move online, or as corporations say, you know what, I'm going to close down more of my banking branches, or I'm going to consolidate services and basically force you to apply online. There's no more paper applications, all of these things. It basically shifts their need to have internet access. And that's where having kind of that strategy, I think that's one of the pieces that's missing potentially, is that, everybody, I think, assumes that everybody has access to the internet, and that's not necessarily true. Statistics would show, especially that, folks in lower income levels or in different populations, lack a high-speed internet access, and that number is pretty staggering. So, as they're faced with choices in their daily lives and their daily budget, internet access isn't number one priority. But that obviously has changed, as we'll talk about the response to COVID. Now it's really more a necessity or must-have than a nice-to-have as it was before.
And Matt, I think that's an important distinction you draw. Is similarly, when I used to teach writing and reading, I would think of the difference between the term being illiterate and illiterate, and here we have that challenge as well, because you mentioned, and I think it's a good example, those who don't want to opt into digital banking, for instance, and don't want to access their bank account through a computer, or let alone use a debit card. They prefer to have the person-to-person experience. And that's a real challenge that we see happening. I think we perceive it to be happening more often in rural settings, where you see bank locations closing and drawing closer into urban centers. But we know that that problem exists too in urban settings in which banks may not be located in neighborhoods to which there's not a high degree of potential lenders that they are interested in serving, or in neighborhoods that where fewer folks live. So there are challenges there where people might not have the access, but then there are the people that just choose not to have the access, that don't want to buy into or opt into a new way of doing things. And that's a real challenge, because I don't get the sense that the internet's slowing down or going away anytime soon.
Right. So, interestingly enough, overall broadband adoption rates in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania are, roughly 82% overall. But broadband adoption rates for households earning less than $20,000 a year, that number falls to 54%. So a huge difference versus overall broadband adoption rate versus, broadband adoption rate it would typically be in an urban setting. And like I said, that's one of those things that when I started doing the research and going through the data, most people feel like, oh, broadband is not a problem. I've got, especially if you're in an urban area, you have usually a cable modem technology, or you have access to, decent cellular service. So you have some options, typically different from those folks that live in rural areas that may not have any cable service and may have limited or no cell phone options depending upon where they live. So it's very interesting to look at that and say, that's something that is a huge challenge, which typically you would think isn't a big issue. So the next thing we'll touch on here is, device affordability and access. So yet again, another challenge that typically most people wouldn't think of. Based upon data from HUD, only 44% of HUD assisted renters own a desktop, laptop, or tablet. So when you think of, filing for a job, completing any sort of online application, online banking, we all know that some of those things work okay on your cell phone. But if you don't have a smartphone, you have no access to that. And if less than half of the folks in the most need in the critical areas don't have a desktop, laptop, or tablet, that's a huge challenge. And then low-income households with children are 4 times more likely to be without an internet connection than a comparable suburban household. So that's something we'll touch on here in one of the next slides, is that point right there is crisis 101 when it came to COVID-19, where typically kids going to school, families, having kids being educated at school or working in a traditional work environment, and moving all of that remote. If you don't have access to the internet, you can't do any of these things. So for a lot of us, that typically, okay, we can work from home. Maybe it's not as functional as working at the office, depending upon, what your function is at home or at the office. If you don't have internet access, that's, basically just like not having electricity or water. So it's that critical level of infrastructure is really one of those things that really hasn't been thought of until now. And I think it's more of a crisis mode, and something that I think policy is trying to play catch up in terms of where we're at with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Matt. Earlier, you made the comment, the internet, access to the web, the internet itself, literally, is now a utility, or should be considered or thought of like a public utility, just like water lines, sewers, and electricity and gas. You really can't function, or increasingly, one can't function in our world without it. And I'm looking at your slide here about low-income households with children are 4 times more likely to be without an internet connection. Well, if they're without an internet connection, they're also probably, by some order of magnitude, more likely to the children there, well, the parents, to not know how to use these things.
Exactly.
So when they're, even if they're provided, this, you mentioned it earlier, just what we're doing right now is to, probably to some folks of my vintage, is kind of, I'm not going to use the word miraculous, but really pretty unbelievable that, we're just doing this all at a remote distance. None of us are in the same place. But we've learned how to use software. Well, you know, when you try to do teaching or instruction remotely, you have to know how to not only have access, you have to know how to use, a laptop, a Chromebook or whatever, but you also have to know how to use the software. And so there's kind of like an escalating, or maybe a better word would be, because it's going down, a cascading effect here, where some of these young children are just at an enormous disadvantage.
That's exactly right. I know I've talked with some of the folks that teach in various school districts across our community, and you know, the training is a challenge because typically you have kids that were not using a device, so you didn't have one-to-one initiatives, or you're used to just using homework and paper and kind of working through that and having a lot of support inside the classroom, to now, you know, focusing all digital. And to your point, Dr. Roth, you got to get over the technology hurdle first to be able to understand how to use the technology, and then you can learn. And I think there's a lot of challenges, and the pandemic has really shown that, you know, yes, we can do these things remote, but we're probably not doing them as well, depending upon the situation, as we would if it was kind of in-person instruction, especially on the education side.
I've done some reading on this. I wouldn't put a number on it or a percentage, and I know the heroic, and I don't use the word lightly, but I have a number of nieces and nephews and other family members, and then friends I know who are teachers in the various school districts in Greater Erie. And I know the heroic efforts that they and some of their colleagues, and I think about at the level of higher education. I was doing some adjunct teaching last winter when this all happened, and I watched the faculty at this particular local institution. You know, faculty sometimes get beat up by administrators like me, you know, oh, they don't want to learn how to do this. Well, the facts of the matter were the faculty made, and I admire them for that, I compliment them for it. Now, I'm not going to be coy. It was the faculty at Mercyhurst University. I mean, I watched them make heroic efforts to you know, do a 180 and figure out how to do this online. But still, there's a level of sophistication students need. And I tend to be an advocate of online education, but I don't think it's an either or issue. I'm kind of getting off track here. We'll get back to I don't think it's either or. I think they actually reinforce one another, but there's a steeper learning curve than people realize to just learn how to use the software that is supposed to teach you. Well, the cliched example that people talk about taking courses online in higher ed is statistics, because the content never changes year over year. I mean, you know, if you're going to do a permutation, a permutation's a permutation. There's a way to calculate that. But you know, there's a steep learning curve in learning how to use the software. In any event, yeah, this is a really important slide you have for public policy, because there's a generation of children who are, you don't get to be 8 years old twice.
Right. Yeah.
So,
exactly right. And
I think whatever grade you're in, and when you're 8, second or third, you don't get to do that. You don't get to do that twice. And so I'm very concerned about what's going to happen here.
And some of the things in terms of access, you know, there are programs that a lot of the national providers provide, you know, Comcast and Spectrums of the world, you know, to provide, you know, low cost service to provide affordability and access. But unfortunately, a lot of those, and this, I think one of the things the pandemic is really showing, is we need to streamline those processes or make them more consistent, because there's potentially a lot of hoops to jump through to get one of those connections to be able to qualify for it. So that's where, and something I'll talk about in a recommendation, potentially fixing some of those challenges, right?
Matt, I think that's a great way to move us along, because I do want to, before we get to your recommendations, thank you for bringing up this slide. I do want to talk about, because we're here doing this trial run and first time ever Raimy Fellowship project public presentation, and we're doing it, all three of us from 3 different locations, having this discussion here, that we've been impacted by COVID-19 and the pandemic. So tell us about some of the things you're seeing on your research, because you had to pivot quite sharply as you were continuing to study this, now looking at all of the ways that the pandemic has shined a light in perhaps to corners that were not being examined as thoroughly prior. So what did you find here?
Yeah, so I mean, the key we touched on a little bit ago is, remote working and virtual classroom experiences kind of have exposed this urban digital divide. So when we basically shut down all the schools and the libraries and all the businesses and, started the lockdowns, and basically sent everybody home, there was really no plan, right? And we kind of looked at like that at the latter end of last year's school year. It's like, well, we're going to kind of like cobble our way through this and try to finish, and then hopefully have a better plan for the fall, which still has some challenges. So that really exposed the need of not everybody has access, really showcased, hey, there's a lot of people going to the library for access, or going to McDonald's, or going to their favorite Tim Hortons or what have you to complete their homework, or Starbucks. But when you close all those places, you basically limited their ability to have access to those facilities to get the basic need. What they're looking for, which is connectivity. And I think we touched on this a second ago, is, the individuals that already lacked the digital literacy skills are now kind of backed into a corner to now say, hey, now your kid's got to have a hybrid work or hybrid learning environment. And maybe you're working from home too, and you have to help support them with their remote learning. So it's kind of that double whammy of, you're already struggling to support yourself, but now you have to support your children, who you personally may not have the skills to kind of walk them through what needs to be done to be able to function in kind of that remote first world. School districts have really kind of stepped up from an education standpoint. We've deployed a lot of school districts that weren't having kind of that one-to-one initiative, which means a device per student. There's a lot of districts that weren't there yet. From CARES Act funding, they were able to quickly deploy one-to-one initiatives to a lot of kids, but still the training wasn't there to be able to support them. Now they're working through it, and Dr. Roth makes a great point. The educators are doing the best that they can to be able to support the students and make remote learning as best as possible. But there's still some gaps there. And we've learned, as we've talked about right now, as Ben, you just alluded to, is video is the new normal. So I kind of take this back to, when the iPhone came out, right? Or any smartphone. Many of us used to carry around our digital camera, and then we had our flip phone, and that's how we took pictures, right? Well, when photos came on your smartphone, like, you just put your digital camera in the closet, unless you have a digital SLR, and people still do that. But it really shifted really quickly, pretty much overnight, that people weren't comfortable with video. They weren't watching as many videos, and now all we do is use Zoom meetings or team meetings or Google Meets or what have you. And that's how we communicate with each other. And we can do it, all over the world and collaborate in a way that we've never thought before. So even more now than ever, people need access to the internet, because that is the utility that's supporting all of this kind of next generation type of things to move people forward. And we're not going back. It's like, just like you're not going to pull out your 2 megapixel digital camera out of your drawer to take photos. We're not going to go back to the days that video isn't the first thing that we're going to do versus having a conference call, right?
And one of the things I just heard from a friend of mine the other day, who happens to be a teacher, and said, I can't believe we haven't been doing parent-teacher conferences virtually before this, of how much more efficient the process is, how much easier it is on the parents, not having to rearrange an entire day to come in and have that ever important conference about their student. But we know that that's a challenge. This does present an option to do things efficiently and not lose perhaps any of the ability or capacity to do that. But we know one of the challenges too with the school districts is not all school districts have the same budgets to work with in terms of providing the resources to students who need those resources, whether it's a laptop or a tablet device to take home or a mobile hotspot to be able to take home. It looks like one of the challenges is that while the school districts are trying, the burden is being passed on to them to ultimately help their students succeed at a level they would be succeeding if they were doing in-person learning. So still a big challenge, but at least something we're much more aware of now through the pandemic.
Now I'll kind of hop over to solutions here real quick. So you bring up a couple things, Ben, so a couple solutions that I'll add to this. So I liked this quote that I found: in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. So that's from Albert Einstein. So, I think obviously Zoom and Microsoft and a lot of the Google and companies have been very fortunate from the pandemic to be able to present these technological solutions to really push us forward. But I think the solutions to consider, and a lot of the stuff that I talked about earlier in terms of the research, is really developing these public and private partnerships to understand the needs and then to leverage the expertise from the private sector and the funding or the access to the individuals in the greatest need from the public sector to expand services and devices. So that's probably the way that's going to happen. It's not going to be some federal program that says, hey, here's some money and make this work. That's probably just going to be a complete waste. Things like expanding the 211, and I think this is something that I believe in Philadelphia has just released a program called PHL Connected, which they're leveraging their regional 211 program to say, okay, if you don't have access to internet, if you're struggling to get connected, call the 211 program and log that. So that way the local institutions can help facilitate how you get access. So is it through a regional or local provider? And in Philadelphia's case, it's Comcast to say, hey, let's fill out the application to get you service. Is it, hey, do I need training? What do we need to do to be able to provide you access? One of the things here locally too is that Erie the region doesn't have a technology plan. There's no group that's really kind of focusing on technology and uncovering the needs of the community and the challenges of the community as a whole. The Technology Council existed; it no longer exists. They were kind of the champion of technology and kind of pushing forward some different initiatives. That's something that I think is something that we definitely should consider here regionally. Also, as we mentioned, the 211 kind of falls into this, is that there's pockets of the community that don't have access, and that could be urban, which is the focus of this presentation, or rural. Sometimes their cries go on deaf ears because they don't have really a streamlined way to engage their either local elected officials or the folks that may have access to some funding or may have access to the technology or wherewithal to solve their problem. There's a disconnect there. And I've talked to many of a local politician or a local community leader or a neighborhood champion that says, hey, I've got so many people living in this area and we have terrible service, and I have talked to 7 different people and haven't heard anything. It's because there's no real regional initiative, and there's kind of different competing resources and funding sources to understand how that works. So making sure that there's some sort of streamlined effort to do that. And then also kind of pandemic allows us to really think about where we live in a different fashion, right? So you see people fleeing New York City for taxes and other reasons, and the same from California, and moving to different areas. And really what we've learned through the pandemic is it doesn't matter where you live per se, it just matters that you have a high quality internet connection. And with any virtual background, I can look wherever, I can work wherever, and even not have a virtual background, and have access to all the amenities of a region. So from an economic development standpoint, really kind of putting together a strategy, and this kind of ties into the regional study group or commission to say, what are the needs of the region? How do we attract those knowledge workers or remote workers? Because if you've seen the news, Microsoft, Google, Twitter, Amazon, they've all made announcements to say, we're basically going remote first for most of our folks. So, are there opportunities for people that live in this region to work for companies that aren't located here? So that helps, control the brain drain and prevent people from leaving. But what's the strategy to kind of build that around? Obviously, technology and access to the internet is a key piece of it. But we kind of need to have a plan. We can't just say, oh, hey, move to Erie, PA. It's a great place to live. Well, if somebody's on Zoom calls or Teams meetings all day and needs access to great internet, we have to have that infrastructure available as well. And then from a funding standpoint, Ben, you had mentioned the school district. So, schools and libraries are funded to get discount service through a program called E-rate, which is a federal program. All of us pay a fee on our phone bills called Universal Service Fund, or USF. So that money goes into a big pool and then gets distributed to schools and libraries to basically push down their cost for service. One of the things that kind of fell apart during discussions in Washington is what we've learned during the pandemic is now typically schools and libraries were funded for just the physical locations where they are. Obviously now with students needing access at home or teachers needing access at home to provide remote services, there has been a lot of talk in Washington to say, hey, there should be a funding mechanism to permit schools to provide some sort of subsidy to students or to teachers to allow them to have access at home. Because right now, for example, if schools are buying hotspots or those sorts of things to provide access to students, they're paying for that out of pocket or using CARES funding for that, and that's not a sustainable long-term solution. So I think there's some solutions to consider there, because that also comes back to the whole concept of, hey, if I've got thousands and thousands of students and I've got thousands of teachers and I've got remote workers that all need access, that kind of comes back to a strategy to say, okay, here are all the people that need access. Even if I have large organizations in a community that has a lot of people that are working from home, hey, is there a way that we can come together as a region and figure out a strategy to put together a plan to say, how do I connect all these folks with a kind of next generation facilities or service that keeps those folks here, provides them the benefits that they need, but then is an attraction method to bring people in from the outside.
Now, those are great solutions to consider in ways to move through this. I really appreciate the thoughtful nature in working through that, seeing some of the things already in place. Using Erie as an example, we have internet providers here providing good, high quality internet. It's the idea of marketing that. How do we do that better? And then regions that do need better, do need the infrastructure, period. How do they get started? Where do they get started? But those that have that infrastructure, how do you continue to improve that? Because I think one of the things that has been a constant through this that you've mentioned is we're not going backwards. We're not going back. We're only moving forward. And while it might be novel to pull out the old Polaroid camera and take Polaroid pictures, we're not going back to a 2-pixel digital camera and making a step back that way. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Dr. Roth, any notes from you before we wrap up today's discussion?
Well, I really want to thank Matt for, like we joked earlier, being our test crash dummy. I think we can honestly say you didn't crash and you're not a dummy. You did a terrific job. I'm really grateful that you took up the challenge. I've been looking at your solutions there, and there's two things that really strike me. And one, we won't get into it, but in our highly polarized times, we tend to forget that public-private partnerships are essentially what build America. We're back to Henry Clay and the American system in the 19th century. We've tended to forget recent years, the public part of that. But I think that's really important, and something at the scale that would need to be done in Erie is going to in fact need a public and a private input. But I also am really intrigued by the economic development strategy. I know a lot of work is being done by the Chamber and others to draw businesses to Erie, but I do think there is an opportunity. I don't know how big an opportunity, but I think a legitimate one. Erie has a very affordable and a very, very high quality of life. I mean, there's a really energetic arts community in Erie that might surprise people that a city of its size. It's also very affordable. And I think and actually, okay, so it snows. And the picture behind me, it doesn't look like that today, but it does look like that. That's a real picture. I was on a Zoom meeting with some people from Cleveland and elsewhere, and one of them said to me, "What are you doing in Florida?" And I said, "That's not Florida, that's Erie, Pennsylvania. That's exactly how it looks. Granted, it doesn't look that way on February 18th, but that's Erie, Pennsylvania." And so I think that last idea of yours is, and I'm not sure who, other than maybe the city and county planning departments would have, and that'd be back to the public-private, would be the ones that would have to try to figure out how you put together a strategy to bring people to work here, because as you said earlier, and has been repeated, we're in 3 different places, and I've been on a number of Zoom calls with people all over the country. And actually, currently, when the Jefferson team meets daily, I'm not on the daily meet every day, but when I'm on it, I note that sometimes Ben's in his Washington office. A couple of us are in Erie, and right now our colleague Angela Beaumont's in Germany. And sometimes other people are in Florida, and yet distance has been obliterated. And we get the work done. The work gets done. So I like that last one. I think that one has a lot of possibilities. The other, though, I think you do, the technology study group might be where maybe some other Raimy Fellow working with from the platform you've created would want to take a look at how exactly that might be implemented and put in place in Erie to move this forward. But in any event, thank you, Matt, for an excellent presentation and a great conversation. And thank you, Ben, for hosting.
Yeah, and thank you both for joining this. And as you mentioned, Dr. Roth, there's already a Raimy Fellow working on advancing some of the work that Matt has already done. And onward we hear the battle cry, and onward we move with progress. So Mr. Matthew Wiertel, Raimy Fellow and Director of Sales and Marketing at Velocity Network, Dr. Andrew Roth, Scholar in Residence at the JES and facilitator of the Raimy Fellowship Program. Thank you both so very much for your time, your energy, and your efforts in joining us for this conversation. To get a sneak peek of upcoming programs and to stream past programs on demand, please visit our website, jeserie.org. There you'll find a wide array of publications ranging from quick, timely reads to reports to essays and more, including past Raimy Idea publications. And you'll catch a copy of this video that you can watch again, stream on demand, and plenty of other things there. Be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.